Hello and welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us for this webinar, the first in our series on learning leadership. My name is Sue Parr and I'm Head of Executive Education at the Open University Business School. I'm delighted to be hosting today's session and equally delighted to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Ben Hardy, who's a lecturer in management at the OUBS.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Over the next half an hour, we want to share with you some of our perspectives and thoughts on what leadership isn't and why this is good news for leaders. And we hope you'll find this interesting and thought-provoking. Just a little bit of information about this series of webinars that we're hosting all this week, which form part of a wider set of activities taking place during Learning at Work Week. The initiative, which we're proud to be sponsoring, is coordinated by the Campaign for Learning and is an annual opportunity to celebrate and promote the benefits of workplace learning. All sorts of organisations are running activities during this week, so thank you very much for taking the time to join us here in this forum. You'll be able to interact with us during this webinar in a number of ways, and thank you already for having done so. You'll see on your screen a chat panel, and we invite you to share your questions there. We'll try and answer as many of those as we can, although time is obviously a little bit tight, and if we don't have time to answer all your questions, we'll aim to follow up with those after today's session. You'll also have a chance to participate in our polls, and we'll be handing over to our technical manager, Andrew, to launch those during the course of the next 30 minutes. Just a quick reminder that this webinar will be recorded and available online after this session, so if any of your colleagues who would like to have joined you weren't able to, you can share this with them then. We also welcome you to tweet your thoughts and perspectives on this webinar. You'll see the details for this at the top of your screen now. So thank you very much, and over to Ben for his opening thoughts on what leadership isn't and why this is good news for leaders.
Leadership fascinates us. We're obsessed with leaders. Part of this is because leaders can achieve extraordinary things. Part of it is because we sometimes hope that the leader will save us from our current predicament. Part of it is because we rather like the power and acclamation which may go with being a leader, and we want some of that. Leadership offers us a remedy for all sorts of organisational ills. The National Health Service needs leadership to be transformed. The school system needs a cadre of leaders to improve education. Whenever a British team fails, there's a cry for leadership. We expect our politicians to display leadership. Leadership is everywhere, and the desire for it is strong and hopeful. Leadership's such an important thing that we want to foster it, to grow it, to reap its benefits. The study of leadership, both formally and informally, has been going on for centuries. But the last 50 years or so have seen an explosion of interest in the topic. I thought it would be interesting to chart this using Google Ngrams. And I looked at the number of mentions of leadership in the various books published over the last 200 years or so. But I needed some comparison, so I also looked at the number of mentions of the word worker, that of course being the lead. And you can see, looking at the chart, that our interest in leadership has been on an upward march for over a century. And interestingly, interest in workers seems to mirror that. But then in about 1940 there's a divergence, and leadership continues to rise, but discussion of workers and the lead rather falls off. Today, a quick look round at the level of discussion on leadership reveals on Google Scholar, which is one of the academic sites where you can find a load of published research, there's about 2.6 million citations. If you go onto Amazon, there are about 88,000 books on leadership. EBSCO, which looks at academic articles, that's got about 42,000 mentions of leadership. So this is interesting. We want to know what leadership is, and we see it as vital, and some very intelligent people have been researching and writing about it, and they've been spreading their findings. And yet, here we are. We seem no further on. Because as a general rule, if there are multiple explanations for a phenomenon, then none of the explanations is wholly correct. This ranges from everything from surgical procedures to learning how to write novels. And the number of leadership theories suggests that there are multiple explanations, and that probably means that none of them fully capture the phenomenon. In spite of this, there are excellent leaders who've never shown the slightest interest in reading any literature on leadership. They do a perfectly good job without any training or help. So we have a situation where there's a vast literature on leadership, and yet it seems not to have cracked the topic. At the same time, there's a bunch of practitioners doing a splendid job. So how is it that academics haven't got to the heart of the matter? Well, there are a number of possible reasons. One group of reasons is to do with the research. And it could be that the research hasn't accurately captured the phenomenon. We just haven't kind of pinned it down. It could also be that we're just in a stage of our understanding evolving. So those are two academic reasons. Another possible reason is that the concept's changing. Leadership today is not the same as leadership 30 years ago. Or it could be even worse than that the concept is unstable in and of itself. On balance, I think it's a bit unfair to blame researchers. Some pretty bright people have worked on this, using some pretty sophisticated techniques. And it may be, possibly, that there is a golden answer to the question of what leadership is. But what's more likely is that they can't find the answer because there is no one answer. It also seems unlikely that leadership is different now to how it was in the past. And it's a bit like Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart's definition of pornography, where he said, "I can't describe it, but I know it when I see it." And so it is with leadership. We tend to recognise and respond to leaders. So at this point we could throw up our hands and say, nobody knows anything, and give up on the idea of learning how to lead, or improving as leaders. But I think to do so would be a mistake. And here's why. It's a bit like the famous story of the two shoe salesmen from competing companies who are sent to a foreign country to assess the market for shoes. Salesman one scouts around for a few days and then goes to the telegraph office to contact company headquarters. He writes, "Research complete. Unmitigated disaster. Nobody here wears shoes." Likewise, salesman 2 does his research and heads for the same telegraph office. Once there, he composes the following message. Research complete. Glorious opportunity. Nobody here wears shoes. I personally think that the uncertainty about leadership represents a glorious opportunity and not an unmitigated disaster. And here's why. The fact that no one's cracked it means the ability to lead is still valuable. When few people could read, the ability to read was valuable and secured an advantage for those who could do it. Now that the population is literate, not being able to read is a disadvantage, but being able to read offers no particular advantage. So if there was a foolproof way of leading, then everyone would do it, and there'd be no particular advantage to being a leader. But being able to lead clearly is advantageous. And the great advantage that we have over others is that we're aware that there's no one single way to lead. It gives us a number of advantages. It frees us from searching for the Holy Grail and enables us to get on with the business of leading. It also means we don't need to be distracted by the business books by great leaders who purport to teach us how to lead, but actually tell us how to be led by them. What we can do is we can carefully think about what we're trying to achieve and the environment in which we're trying to achieve it, and then get on with the job of leading and learning, rather than worrying about whether we're using the right approach. That's not to say that the research on leadership is useless. Far from it, and we're going to spend a little bit of time thinking about it in a moment. The research on leadership is extremely useful. If you follow the prescriptions of any one leadership theory, it's unlikely to turn you into a leader. But this doesn't stop these theories being useful in helping us to think about how to lead.
Thanks very much, Ben. Looking forward to the next bit already. I'd just like to launch the first poll, which you can see on your screen now. So why do we value leadership so much? A, because leaders are an essential part of life. B, because we look to others to advise us on the best course of action. C, because we hope that we too might become a leader in due course. And D, because we want someone else to take responsibility. Using your voting button, be really interested to hear what your reaction is to that poll. And we'll obviously share those responses as soon as we can. I've got a couple of questions, Ben, while we're waiting for those poll results to come in. One that I've just come here from Loretta. What are the prerequisites for good leadership?
That's a really good question. Thank you, Loretta, for that. I think it's one of these things that I hesitate to say that there's a right answer. And you'll find that I'm doing this quite a lot during this session. And that's kind of the problem. There's no one way of doing it. What we're going to unpack in the second part of this is some of the theories around leadership and it will cover some of the prerequisites. There are certain things that have been shown to correlate with leader performance, but as always, it's a correlation, and very often we find examples where people don't demonstrate these traits and yet are extremely effective leaders. So the one I always think about is extroversion, which is one of the classic personality traits, is correlates with being an effective leader. However, there are plenty of introverted leaders out there who actually do a very good job. So Barack Obama is by any measure an introvert, but he's quite an effective leader, and he's been very successful getting to the US presidency. So I think it's difficult to say if you've got these things you'll be a successful an effective leader or successful leader, because it's more contextual than that. And as we'll see in the second stage of this, very often it's about a set of characteristics coming together with a particular situation and a particular set of followers, and that then influences and creates effective leadership.
There's so many good questions coming in here. This is going to be an interesting one. But one from Teresa: why do you think companies feel like they need a raft of leaders?
I saw that question, Teresa, and I thought that's a great question. I think management in some ways is a bit of a Cinderella idea. People get very hung up on the difference between leadership and management, and there is a sort of problem in the leadership literature that you can end up with people saying, well, leaders are everywhere, and leadership sort of becomes everywhere and then simultaneously nowhere. Leadership often, particularly in the kind of charismatic conception, is about drawing people in a particular direction. Management would be, say, more about putting in place structures to get people to go in a particular direction. Companies love sending people on leadership seminars and leadership development things because it sounds good. You know, being sent away on a leadership course sounds like you've been marked out and it's very effective, and you're progressing up the corporate hierarchy. But if you've got leaders but no management, that's kind of a problem, because there's all these people advocating all these things but no way of actually getting it done. Flip side of it being, if you've got a bunch of managers but no direction, then that's also a problem. So I think it's important that organisations develop both.
Thanks very much, Ben, and do keep sending in questions. We'll try and answer them as much as we can. I've got the results now of the poll that we launched a little while ago. So A, because leaders are an essential part of our life, 42% of people who voted agreed with that. So that comes out a clear winner at the moment, although 38%, I beg your pardon, thought B, because we look to others to advise us on the best course of action. Just under 15% thought because we hope that we too might become a leader, and just over 5% because we want someone else to take responsibility. Okay, we'll just lead in now to the next video.
So let's look at some of these leadership theories and how they might help or hinder us. We'll do this in roughly historical order, as it will help to see how our understanding of leadership has evolved and where we might make a difference. The trait theories of leadership believe that there's something innate in the individual, which means that there's a leader. And there's been lots of research in this area, as the idea that you can identify leaders from their characteristics is very appealing. Looking over the results of lots of studies, it seems that there are various personality factors which are related to leadership. In a way, these results are unsurprising. Being extroverted, dependable, autonomous, honest, charismatic, intelligent, and wanting to achieve are all correlated with success as a leader. But if we sat in a pub and put together a list of things that we think leaders should have, then we'd get something that looked like that. What's interesting is that these traits only explain a fairly small percentage of performance. So the possibility of not being these things, yet being successful, is still wide open. So we don't need to be extroverted or charismatic or even achievement-oriented to be a leader. But it seems that sometimes, in some cases, it might help. So the take-home message here is that we need to think about what skills we bring to leading and incorporate these into our leadership style. The behavioural theories are less concerned with the innate characteristics of the leader, but rather the way in which they behave towards others. So there are two elements in these behavioural theories. One is consideration, which is how the degree to which leaders are concerned about their subordinates as people. And you can see on the chart that we've got, it's called concern for people. And then there's the initiating structure, which is how leaders portion out the work. These theories show up in recent theories, such as positive psychology, where people attempt to modify people's behaviour, for example, by using praise to encourage people in the right direction so that they perform better. Transformational leadership is contrasted with transactional leadership. Transactional leadership is really an exchange between leader and follower. Transformational leadership is where the interests of the followers are transformed to match the leader or the groups. In charismatic leadership, the leadership actually transforms the subordinates' interests to match their own. And this has been very popular in recent times. The idea that leaders can align and motivate through the power of words is a very powerful idea. Think of Steve Jobs' second running of Apple, or Barack Obama's 2008 election campaign, where he talked about hope and transforming the hope of his followers. But perhaps the best example of this is the St. Crispin's Day speech from Henry V. In this speech, the king doesn't order anyone to fight. Rather, he tells a story of how fighting will be a noble thing. And he also does some clever things, like explicitly links the soldier's objectives and pride to his own needs. There are elements of path goal here, sure, that we just talked about, but the emotionally laden appeal means that this is much more charismatic and transformational. So the take-home message of these theories is that we need to think about the stories we tell, and, if we're leading change, how we encourage people to follow our path. Post-transformational leadership is a response to the dark side of transformational leadership, where scandals like Enron and various other dot-com scandals, where very charismatic leaders sucked their followers into kind of unethical paths or paths that weren't very good for society. This form of leadership was produced in response to that. This list of leadership theories does two things. Firstly, it shows that despite a tremendous volume of research, no one has really kind of nailed the concept of leadership. The second thing it shows is that even if these theories are not true in any objective sense, they are useful, and that we can take some of the ideas away from them. We've extracted a number of ideas from the research. We've taken self-awareness from trait theory, praise and encouragement from the behavioural theories, flexibility from the situational and contingent theories, joining up goals from exchange and path goal theories, using emotion to align followers with our objectives from transformational leadership, and authentic and ethical behaviour to maintain followers' commitment from post-transformational leadership. Some of these themes tie in with the results of Project Globe, which was a worldwide project in which 17,500 middle managers from all 65 countries in over 800 organisations, they were asked what they thought constituted a good leader. Overall, those surveyed believed that being trustworthy, just and honest were important, as well as having foresight and planning ahead. Being positive, dynamic, encouraging, motivating and building confidence were also important, as was being communicative, informed and coordinating teams. These were the key elements of being a leader. But what's interesting was that there was also some culturally contingent aspects of leadership. So the degree of individuality, that was important in some cultures but not in others. Status consciousness, again, important in some cultures and others. The degree of risk-taking, again, important in some cultures but not others. What is interesting about Project Globe is that we can see links between our list culled from the leadership theories and those from Project Globe. And that suggests that there are some elements of leadership which are common to both lists and which depend on the situation. But this talk promised to tell you what leadership is not, and it's to this that we'll turn in the third part of this lecture.
Thanks very much, Ben. And looking at all the questions we're receiving, it's obviously stimulating a lot of discussion. But before I look to any of those questions again, I'd like to launch our second poll. I think the results of the first one surprised a few people, so let's see what happens with the second. Great leaders emerge amidst, and you see on your screens now, A, major events and important decisions, B, everyday life, C, in times of confusion, D, as a result of planning, and E, when we least expect it. So again, if you can press your poll buttons, and we'll get the results of that shortly. A number of the questions that seem to have come up have dealt very much then with the, is it the context, the culture that helps inform the style of leadership? Sorry, I'm paraphrasing quite a few, but a number of them are around that.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Context and culture certainly do influence, and you do see in different organisations different cultures. Even within the university sector, different universities have different cultures, and that affects how leaders behave. So, yeah, culture certainly interacts, and if you try and act in a way that's completely inconsistent with the culture, unless you're in a very powerful position or you're telling a particularly good story, then it could be very difficult to get things done. You see this when a new leader perhaps comes into an organisation and tries to do something that's countercultural. Unless she or he can co-opt everyone on their side, actually they can quite often come unstuck. And we do see this particularly when people come into new organisations. It is sometimes the culture will just kind of push them out. So culture can have a very important effect unless the leader is actually able to change it.
I think that picks up from a question from Peter here about you could have all these traits and still not be seen as a leader by the organisation. Is that partly impacted by their culture, do you think?
That could be partly impacted by the culture. It could be that those traits aren't valued by the organisation. It could be that you're in the wrong position in the organisation as far as the organisation itself is concerned. Yeah, it could be very easily. You could have all these traits and not be seen as a leader.
There's also a question here about the difference between, and it's termed military-style leadership and civilian leadership, and how can you bridge the gap between the two?
I'm not sure I'd make that distinction. I think they're all forms of leadership. You see some very authoritarian military, or a particularly stark, I think hard was the term someone used, style of leadership in sort of civilian organisations, but you also sometimes see very soft and I think in this particular characterisation more civilian type leadership in some aspects of the military. It really depends. I'm not sure that I'd make a distinction between military and civilian.
Thanks, Ben. We've got the results now of the poll, and I noticed that a number of people have said that we ought to have included an F, all of the above.
Right.
I think it's probably fair enough. The one that, if you like, came out top is B, with 37.7%, so that's everyday life. A with 29.2%, that's major events and important decisions. C, 20.8% in times of confusion. D, just under 3% as a result of planning, and E, 9.5% for when we least expect it. Well, thank you for taking part in that poll, and we'll move again now to the final video.
Project Globe, which I talked about in the last segment, also explored some of the factors which followers deplored in their leaders. And these included being a loner and asocial, so really a bit socially isolated, not involving people, being non-cooperative and irritable, and being dictatorial or autocratic. This isn't quite the same thing as saying what leadership is not. So let's think about some of the myths of leadership. Rob Goffey and Gareth Jones identified some myths about leadership. The first one was that anyone can be a leader, and this simply isn't true. Some people lack either the self-awareness or authenticity to lead. The second is that people who get to the top are leaders. Unfortunately, the expression, the cream and the scum rise to the top alike, has some merit. Some people find their way to the top of organisations on the basis of their political skills rather than their leadership ones. And the third is that leaders deliver business results. Other factors are often in play. One of the worst-led companies I've ever encountered is currently doing very well as a result of a technological advantage. despite having terrible leadership. To these myths we can add some other ideas about what leadership is not. So the first thing is, it's not a flattering description of how wonderful you or any other leader is. Unfortunately, this is what all too many of the books on leadership written by leaders are about. Moreover, being good at leading does not mean that you're good at teaching leading, and all too often these books are vanity projects. Leadership isn't a description of a task. Leadership is something which helps a task get achieved, but it is not the task. In some circumstances it may initiate a task, but leadership is not a description of how to get a task done. Leadership isn't a status you've achieved. Just because you're in a leadership position, it doesn't make you a leader. Plenty of people are in leadership positions who do not lead. You can lead from almost any position, and you can fail to lead from almost any position. Leadership is about what you do, not about your position. Leadership's not something that only great men can do. In the trait theories of behaviour, and this is the fault of the historian Thomas Carlyle, who said history is nothing but the story of great men. This is nonsense. And in 2014, I really hope there's no one out there that seriously believes that only men can lead. Leadership's not the contents of a book, and we've talked at length about the literature and how it doesn't tell you how to lead. But what the literature and the books can do is give you some idea of how you might handle situations, effectively enlarging your menu of possible options. Be very cautious about bulleted lists of leadership or exhortation to do these 3 things to succeed. It's a bit more complicated than that. So this talk might seem an odd one to begin a series of talks about leadership, as it emphasises what leadership is not. But there's a good reason for this. By understanding what leadership is not, we can free ourselves from the shackles and constraints of the literature on leadership. We don't have to follow templates or strictures. We can get on with the business of thinking about leadership, and then we can get on with the business of leading.
Again, one question I want to put in here, because I know we're very short of time, but an interesting one here from Jan saying, could this be the hardest time to be a leader? A quote that I think she's heard somewhere before.
I don't know. It's an interest. It's a question I hadn't thought about at all. Thank you, Jan. I'm always a bit suspicious of these things, just as when anyone stands up and says the pace of change is faster than ever before. It's one of these things that immediately leaves me wondering, well, what evidence might support that? And in terms of the pace of change thing, by the way, I suspect if you were alive during the English Civil War and who was ruling the country was changing every 5 minutes, that was quite a lot of change. But that's a slight aside. I think I'd be hesitant to say it's the hardest time of all to lead, simply because we always tend to think that things at the present time are more difficult or more complex than they were in the past, because distance has a tendency to airbrush out a lot of the ambiguity and complexity, and we see things quite starkly from the past, as indeed people in the future will look at the times now and see them much more starkly. But when you're actually in the middle of the thing, it's very difficult, it's muddled, and I think that is worth touching upon about leadership. It's really difficult. We're a lot of the time blundering around in the fog trying to get stuff done. It's not like there's this beautiful crystalline path opening up before us that we just say, yes, we must do this. It's tough. It's really tough. And what I wanted to do in this webinar was really get at some of the complexity of it, so that people didn't feel that they were doing stuff wrong. If you think about it carefully, and careful thought and understanding of the literature is really helpful, because it gives you options. These things, I think, help you lead.
Thanks very much, Ben. I'm reluctantly going to have to draw this to a close, sadly, because it's great, and there's so many more questions I'd like to have had time for. But thank you very much for joining us today. We are going to be showing some links that you might find helpful on the screen shortly. We hope that you're going to be able to join us for some of the other days this week. And obviously this webinar and the links that you'll see now are available after this session closes. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks very much.